Marwan Muasher, why do you think it's been so hard for those who led the Arab uprisings, who led the uprisings rather, in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, arguably a younger, more moderate generation, to take the reins of power?
Well, we have to understand that, one, these forces were not organized. And whereas they started the revolutions, only the organized forces, which were the Islamists, were able to make use of this. We also have to understand that the region has not been living in a culture of democracy and diversity, and therefore, it did not have political institutions, it did not have a civil society, institutions that are capable of filling the void and the vacuum that took place as a result of these revolutions. The status quo in the Arab world was not sustainable, obviously, and it was kept artificially stable by autocratic regimes. Once the lid was taken off, all kinds of issues came out. But it's going to take a long time for institutions to be built and for a culture of diversity to really set in. That is why, so far, the young generation that has not, as I said, that has started the revolutions has not so far been able, because of lack of organization, because of inexperience and youth, has not been able to basically fill that void.
Let's talk about the so-called first awakening that occurred in the 19th century. Talk about that and to what degree that set the stage for what we are witnessing today.
The first awakening was first an intellectual movement that started in the mid-19th century that talked about the Arab world needing to get itself rid of Ottoman rule at the time, and then later on colonial rule. Later on, this intellectual movement, which started in Lebanon, in Egypt, and places like that, found itself into popular movements that really, worked for the end of colonial and Ottoman rule. But it stopped at that. In other words, where it succeeded at achieving independence for the Arab world, it did not go beyond that to put in place a pluralistic society and develop the institutions needed for democracy. And therefore, all the secular forces which actually ruled the Arab world after independence did not give pluralism or democracy any attention. And that is why, the frustration that we've seen and which took place over a course of 50, 60 years, finally erupted into the Arab uprisings of today. My argument is that the second Arab awakening, this historical transformation that we are witnessing in the Arab world today, cannot stop where the first one did, by deposing, corrupt or autocratic rulers. That in itself is not enough. What needs to be done is also to put in a place of a culture of pluralism and diversity, so that prosperity is the order of the day in the Arab world. It's such a simple message that should be really self-evident, that no culture, no society can prosper without a culture of diversity. And yet that is not what we have seen or are seeing today. What we have seen today are exclusionist forces, both Islamist or religious and secular, engaged in a winner-take-all strategy in the Arab world. And so you see a place like Egypt where the Islamists have behaved as if the elections mean everything and tried to push forward a constitution that did not enjoy consensus among the other elements of society. But you also are seeing secular groups today lining with the military, pushing the Islamists out, and also trying to push forward, a constitution without a consensus among all sectors of society, and demonizing the other force. As long as this remains a zero-sum game between the Islamists and the secular elements in society, I've argued that the sum will be zero. In other words, this cannot be just a battle between the Islamists and the secular elements. It has to be a battle for pluralism by both. What I mean by that is that both should work to guarantee the right, not just of themselves to operate, but also the right of others to operate in such a system, even if they don't agree with their views. And unless and until that is done, the Arab world is going to be mired in conflicts that we are seeing in different places of the Arab world without putting in the necessary stones for democracy.
When and how do you think we will get to this point? When will we see a so-called third force for democracy and pluralism assert itself as a credible alternative?
I argue in the book that there are no shortcuts to democracy, so no one should expect a transformational process such as the one that is going on to unfold in 2 or 3 or 5 years. It has not done so anywhere else in the world. There is no reason to expect that it will do so in the Arab world. This is going to require hard work on the ground for decades by forces who truly believe in pluralism. Working with the people, not just to talk to them about pluralism, but to also suggest programs that answer people's needs in terms of creating jobs, in terms of a more inclusive growth, etc. It is going to require things like revisiting the educational system in the Arab world, where the value system needs to include critical thinking, tolerance of other points of view, questioning authorities, etc. All of that is still not done and won't be done. And even if it is done, tomorrow morning, the results won't be felt for decades. A lot of the secular forces in society today, want things to happen overnight and I think that by pushing the Islamists out, just as the Islamists think that by pushing the secular elements out, societies in the Arab world are going to be stable. That's not going to be the case. Everybody has to work for a culture of pluralism. In my own view, this is something that will take in the Arab world, 30, 40, 50 years. But at least the possibility of this resulting in pluralistic society has been made possible by the Arab uprisings. At least the battle has started, whereas this battle was artificially kept on hold for decades and no one was allowed to question authority and to present different points of view. Now that the battle has started, it is up to the Arabs to decide whether it is going to result in pluralistic societies or whether it is just going to replace one set of dictators by another.